So there's two different ways of doing what we're going to do today. One way is to look at the first couple of words in the first pasuk, and the other way is to look at everything else. So I will explain. It starts off when it says ve'ele hamishpatim. So right, and you want the rest of it? Asher tasim lefneim. That doesn't concern me. Ve'ele hamishpatim. So what do you do with this ve'ele hamishpatim? And the vav there does take us to something which was prior. And I just want to say it in a couple different ways. Ve'ele hamishpatim, and these are the additional mishpatim. Ve'ele hamishpatim, and these are the mishpatim. Ve'ele hamishpatim, and then we need to understand what exactly the mishpatim are. So the first problem which really presents itself over here is one of context. So now that's why I said that there's two ways of doing this. You know what? It's more than that. It's context and then content. So there's two ways of doing it. One way would be essentially the first thing I did when I started to prepare this week, and that was to read through the entire Parsha, right? I tell you that. That's the first thing I always do is I read through the Parsha, Shtayim Mikra, Echer Targum, and as I'm reading and as I'm learning, I'm keeping track. And the next thing that I did is I went back again immediately afterwards, and I started charting each one of the mitzvot. Now, there's two things to do as you're charting what's there. What's that? One is to try to understand the pattern, to understand similarity, to understand why things are there. What's the other thing which is more difficult, which is much more annoying, which is, of course, one of the things I'm going to focus on, is going to be what's not there. Because when you have a list of things that are there, then you also want to say, hold it, what's not over here? So we can call this the paranoid parshanut, right? Why is that not there? And then what's going on? So that's also something to think about. And then the other thing is how orthodox you want, I mean with a small o, how orthodox you want to be in terms of trying to make things fit and say that there is this larger system over here. In a certain sense, and we'll see some of the commentaries do this, in a certain sense, that is a very 19th century intellectual process which goes into big theories. They're very much into especially Germany, big theory of things. So what's the good thing about big theories? How you see, wow, look how everything fits into it. What's the bad thing? The bad thing is you sometimes by force make things fit into it, even though they don't necessarily fit in easily. So keep all of that in mind as we start reading. But what we're going to see over here is that regarding these fundamental questions, ve'ela mishpatim, what exactly did the ve'ela mishpatim mean? So let's begin. Ibn Ezra in source number 2. Now note, there's two different commentaries of Ibn Ezra. Source number 2 is the Parish HaAruch. Source number 3 is the Parish HaKatzer. Of course, if you go open up and look inside by both of them, you'll find the Parish HaAruch, which is the long commentary, is short on this verse, and the short commentary, you'll notice, is long in this particular thing. So much for big theories, right? The more important thing about the two commentaries is when he wrote them, and it's not necessarily agreed upon by all scholars of Ibn Ezra, but essentially one is, and I believe the Katzer is the first one, which is most likely before he came in contact with various Baalei Tosfot, most importantly the Rashbam, but every word I'm saying right now is subject to scholarly debate, so let them debate. Source number 2, Ibn Ezra, Ve'ela Mishpatim. Now notice, right away, what do you realize what he's doing? Ve'ela mishpatim. So what does it come after? So he's going to tell you what it comes after. Now realize something, that whenever someone's going to say, oh, this comes after, you now have every single thing prior to this in the Torah as a possibility of what it follows. Right? I'm just saying as far as your possibilities are, but he goes for the easiest one. Ve'ela mishpatim. Achar she'amru Yisrael l'Moshe. Daber ita ata imanu v'nishma'a. So let's get the context on this. We're going to come back at this. We're going to look at this inside. But right now, after the incredible display of the Aseret Dibrot ends, right then the people then say to Moshe, this is too much. It's overwhelming. If you speak to us, then we'll be capable of hearing. But if God speaks to us, then we could die. So right there, the Ibn Ezra is saying, "Ve'ela mishpatim achas OUisrael Moshe the beritayimanu Amar Hashem l'Moshe b'gishto ela arafel." So then Moshe alone goes up to the cloud and says, "Kol tamru b'nei Israel." This is what you should tell them. V'hachela has here el Elohei Zahav, and then he starts to give certain warnings about gods, plural, small g, out of gold. V'shichrot brit imahem britito, and of forming a covenant when he comes down. Sh'Hashem levado yelehem leElohim, which means reject all other pagan gods and there's only one God. V'ro hamishpatim v'hamitzvot sheyomar lehem, and then he gives instructions regarding the mishpatim and the mitzvot. Now again, we could decide how literal we want to be with each one of those words and what they mean. Im yikablum az yichot lehem brit, which means that's really the question. Will you accept them? Because by the way, I don't know if he said this strong enough, but over here, OUisrael may have just now rejected something by saying, God, don't speak to us. So now comes, will you accept what is said? Then this and this is what's going to happen. V'amar lo b'sof eila t'naim Parshat hinei anochi sholech malach lefanecha. By the way, what he just now did is he essentially said this section, our Mishpatim section, begins with Kaf Aleph, Pasuk Aleph. By the way, maybe, because I can also claim maybe it begins. See, this is what's a little awkward. We have at the end of last week's Parsha, and yes, we know all the time, we keep in mind, the division of the Parshiyot is artificial, and the division of the chapters is artificial. So therefore God stops speaking, the people say stop. Now that could be the beginning of a section. But the chapter and the Parsha end with God saying a couple of things. We'll go back and look what those things are, because we're starting, and his Parshanot is on Ve'ela Mishpatim, which means there's something new. Now where does that end? So he just gave you a hint where it ends. It goes all of chapter 21, all of chapter 22, and now we can argue how far into chapter 23, but he says take a look till Parakaf Gimel Pasuk Kaf. But that is perhaps very much part of what he's calling a Brit right now. Vikar HaParsha, and the main focus of this section is Lashmid Avodat Glulim Me'artzam Bichanasa Sham. And the main issue over here is the eradication of idolatry when you enter into the land. That's what Moshe says at the end. Notice he just now went at the end, he just now went to Dvarim. Now this is great. I didn't translate everything, but this is great what he just now did. He said, what is this all about? And I'm very sympathetic right now. It's all about Israel. And what is it about Israel? We need to be deserving to be in Israel. And how are we deserving to be in Israel? We need to get rid of all of the pagan, all the idols, all the pagan influences. We have to eradicate, and then we can be in the land of Israel. Now this is great. And I want to start off now. We can look in a second at the Ibn Ezra's other interpretation, which is so radically different from this. And if I had to give points, I'm a little stuck, but I'll explain in a second. What did he just now do? He did what I guess all of you, my fellow Zionist conspirationists, right? The elders of Zion who are sitting here with me. We're very sympathetic to say, okay, so what's the Torah about? The Torah is about the land of Israel. And what's the covenant about? We deserve to be in the land of Israel. And there's something which bothers me about this. And maybe it bothers you, maybe it doesn't bother you. Last week we had the Aseret HaDibrot. Should we now play the game? What was missing? Answer, land of Israel. No references. You go through Parshat Mishpatim and Parakaf Aleph and Parakaf Bed and Parakaf Gimel. Now, I am exaggerating, so I'm going to couch it in a certain way. For the most part, this has nothing to do with Israel. Let's do everything all over again. We can start all over again. And this is something I've done before, which therefore is completely not interesting to me now. And that would be to take the various Mishpatim, again, in Perik, Kaf Aleph, Kaf Kaf Gimel, and compare them with either, so now there's two, Ve'ela Mishpatim. Now I can compare it with one of two things. One is I can compare it to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. And the reason why I would do that, maybe the rest of the pasuk, Eila Mishpatim asher tasim lefneim. These are the ones he placed in front of the Jews, as opposed to the Sheva Mitzvah Pnei Noach. Just keep that in mind, because we're going to see some interesting midrashim. The other thing I could do is I can compare everything in Parshat Mishpatim to the Aseret HaDibrot. And very frankly, as I read through it, that's really what's in my mind. To what extent are the things described in these various chapters expansions, and sometimes moving a little bit laterally, compared to the Aseret HaDibrot. So I'll say it again. That to me is almost like it's the low-hanging fruit, is to take Aseret HaDibrot, put them on one side, and take all of Parshat Mishpatim, and then just say which one, or ones, because sometimes there's some overlap, which things over here, or to what extent is this the extension of what we saw in the Aseret HaDibrot. And by the way, that will be real easy work. Again, it'll bear fruit. It'll be easy work. And on top of everything else, it may probably, most likely, it's true. I mean, that's what's really going on over here. But I'm going to say it again now. But what about the absence of the land of Israel? Again, if I had to be a little bit more dramatic about that, we can go back to the point which, again, I think is the crucial point, where we finally realize that there are two different paths. Maybe we realize that as a people, when we got to Parshat B'Shalach, right, he doesn't take us derech eretz plushtim ki karovu, but that's in a certain sense is absurd. We can't go derech eretz plushtim. Why? Because of what happened all the way back in Perek Gimel, when Moshe was standing by the sneh, where God says to Moshe, you're going to take the people out, and you're going to take them to the land that flows with milk and honey, and so on. And then he says, oh yeah, by the way, when you come out, you'll serve God on this mountain, which by the way means you can't go derech eretz plushtim, because we have to come to this mountain. And what happens on this mountain? Well, something's going to happen on this mountain. We find out what happens on this mountain. We end up getting lots and lots of law. And now I go back to the law that we get. That's part of the problem. That's part of last week's Parsha, which means it's not just that I have two different paths. One path is to go directly, right? Don't pass go, directly go to the land of Israel and live happily ever after. That's the one possibility. And the other possibility is to go and take this little bit of a detour, and you're going to stand by Har Sinai and you're going to get something. But what do we get? We get Torah. Now, again, it's really interesting that the Torah is something which is given outside of the land of Israel, because, again, we've done this. Because it could have been given. We could have taken us to Yerushalayim, and then we could have had this loud voice saying, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah dvar Hashem miyushalayim. Nobody here would have complained, right? Just like later on we have Hakel to remember, to commemorate that we were given the Torah at Sinai. Why not just give the Torah at Har HaMoriah, and then Hakel every time could be a repetition of what exactly did take place. So now, again, if you think about this, it's not just it wasn't given in Israel. It's that it was given in the desert and doesn't discuss Israel. And now I go back to the Mishpatim, and I love the Ibn Ezra over here, because see, this is the big theory. This is what it's all about. What's it? Torah. What's it all about? It's about living in the lands of Israel. Great. And what about it? How do you live in the land of Israel? Got rid of all the idolatry, which is great, except for every single detail in Perek Kaf Aleph and Perek Kaf Bet, at least. It doesn't talk about that. It talks about these general laws. Again, interesting how much to compare and contrast with. And now you could take your pick. Sever Mitzvot, you want Aseret HaDibrot, you even want to go to the Code of Hammurabi, go to the Code of Hammurabi, which, by the way, I read an article not that long ago, which means around 5 years ago, and it was by Josh Berman, who's a wonderful, wonderful professor in Bar Ilan. He's a friend, and he noted and brought evidence that the Code of Hammurabi was aspirational and was not law, which it's kind of like saying, you can imagine this, an anthropologist will say, we know what life was in America because we read the Liberty Bell. And therefore, in America, freedom and liberty rang throughout the land, because that's what it says on the Liberty Bell, right? Would everybody agree that is, that we can use that as evidence? You don't want the Liberty Bell, you want the Statue of Liberty, whatever you want, but to say, no, that's aspirational. That's what we would like things to be, but it's not. Oh, for you in England, I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, so again, when we start comparing these things, one of the things that troubles us is the lack of Israel there. And by the way, this is just a small part of the problem. If the other part of the problem is, yes, the Mishnah is from Eretz Yisrael, but the Babylonian Talmud is not. Talmud Bavli, guess where that's from? Okay, good. So, but it's not just and again, some of you can say, yeah, well, we have a Talmud We have a Talmud from Eretz Yisrael. And all of this is a little bit more awkward because both Talmuds are full of scholars from both, but the Talmud Bavli is where the most serious discussions and the law emerges from Bavel. And that has, again, this direct impact on Jewish communities all over the world. Can we also be honest? All of our great Rishonim, again, don't pick on the ones who ended up moving to Israel. All of our great Rishonim lived in other places. So it's Rashi, and then following all the Balei Tosfot, it's Germany, and it's France, and it's England, and then all the Chachmei Sfarad from Spain and the generations and so on, which means the vast majority of Torah that was taught and learned and experienced was outside of the land of Israel. And I know that there were those who right now can pause and say, and it's true, they can say, well, the Torah can be practiced anywhere. The Torah has to be made in such a way that it can take place any place, even though we could then say yes, but not necessarily in its perfect sense. So I think now we understand some of the tension, and now we realize what we're doing is much more complex because we're noting on the one hand what is here, and then trying to figure out what's the content and figuring out what's the context. And on the other, you want that for the title? Content and context? It's yours. There you go. What? Don't listen to them. Just write it down. Well, so I have to listen. But watch the 90-second movie, and that's it anyway. It's not even 90 seconds, right? It's like 18 seconds? Okay. That's all that we need. Content and context? Now you know it's good. Okay. Let's keep going, and we'll have to try to figure out something. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. So No, I'm saying the Ibn Ezra is fascinating because the Ibn Ezra is saying, oh, this is what it's all about. But in order to say what it's all about, he actually had to completely ignore just two things, content and context, right? But aside from that, it's perfect. And then you look at the other Ibn Ezra commentary, the long Perish HaKatzar, right? In source number 3, Ve'ela Mishpatim Mishatim L'Fneim, Kimo V'yasim L'Fneim, which by the way is preparations, Perikitet, preparation for Torah. V'zot Torah Shasam Moshe, B'Peh B'Mechtav O B'Shneim. This is Torah we give you. We give it over. It could be in writing. It could be audibly. V'Kodem She'afaresh Zota Parsha Omaba Klau. And before I explain this, I'm going to give you a generality that you need to know, a principle. Shekol Mitzvah U'Mishpat. Each one of these things is independently and stands to be understood by itself. Even though sometimes you're going to find that there is a connection, which is each one, and maybe even both stands by itself, and also there's some kind of a connection with the context. Here he just now told you what Parshat Mishpatim is about. Somebody who has power not to use violence and not to hurt the weaker or the disenfranchised. That's the whole Parsha. That's what Mishpatim are. That was easy. By the way, we can stop now because now we know what Parshat Mishpatim is about. By the way, you notice the difference in the two different commentaries, the machloket between the Ibn Ezra and the Ibn Ezra? There's two different commentaries. One actually deals with what it says over here, and then actually goes into details. And he says, well, let's look at details, if you want. When it comes to abuse of somebody, like the servant, the slave, and then the maid, and what does he then do? If you want, we can read through all of it. He goes through all of the details over here, and it's all about abuse. It's all about, by the way, this is the history of the world, the powerful abusing the weak. That's the history of the world. And he says, what's the Mishpatim here? To break a vicious cycle in order to say might does not make right. It's not just because I have the ability of hurting somebody else. I need to control that ability of hurting others. We need to put principles in mind. We need to protect the weak. That's what the Mishpatim are. Mishpatim is about protecting the weak. Now, if you had to compare the two commentaries of the Ibn Ezra, Again, it's a little unfair because I didn't read the whole thing. But if you compare the two, so which one do you like more? Well, there's no question that the second one is actually commentary to what it says over here, while those of us who are for Brenta Tzionim, maybe we like the first one because everything's about Israel at the end of the day. So he does move a little bit forward and does touch the other things that don't as easily fit into it. And I just want to move over. V'yiskir zaveach Elohim. He talks about seduction, who's also weak. V'yiskir ger toshev ki ozer lo, which is interesting. The ger toshev has no one else to help. Again, it's the weak. The almana, the ayatom, v'gam ha'ani, the poor. So again, he has the big theory over here. So it's interesting. It's two different big theories that the Ibn Ezra is working with. And again, all the people interested in pseudo-psychology want to analyze how the Ibn Ezra may have changed when he moved from his hometown to other places and saw other things involved. Again, you could, and I didn't even tell you which one he wrote first. So let's continue a little bit more. There are some things towards the end which are probably more important, but I'm skipping them now because I want to go back. In source number 4, we have what I alluded to before. The people, they see the sounds and so on, and the mountains full of smoke. And the people see this. The people start to shake, and they stand at a distance. They say to Moshe, if you speak, then we can hear. And don't let God speak to us because we're going to die. And here's what I skipped before. And I want you to register and to pay attention to this, and then we'll have to figure out what to do with it. Moshe says to the people, Al tiro, do not be afraid. And we noted this pasuk last week as well. Because God came to uplift you. That the fear of God should be upon you. That you won't sin. That plea for Moshe didn't work. They stayed far away. Moshe nigasha al Raphael. Now you remember this was the verse that had been stated, and Moshe then goes into the mist, Asher Shama Elokim, where God was waiting. But Yomar Shema Moshe, and God says to Moshe, Ko Tamar El Bnei Israel. This is what you should tell the people. You witnessed, you saw, you experienced that God spoke to you from the heavens. Lo ta'asun iti Elohi kesef Elohi zahav lo ta'asu lachem. Don't make any kind of idols. Don't make any kinds of images or false gods. Now, if you just pause there for a second, do you realize what happened? And if you don't realize what happened, we can read the Ramban in a second in source number 5. And what happened is that there is an expansion of the first two dibrot. Anochi Hashem, you saw with your eyes. You saw something which is impossible to see, which is why they freaked out. What's the second thing? Don't have any other gods. Don't make graven images. And what's the next thing which is said? Don't make any graven images. But there's a difference over here. What's the difference? Is that here it's Vayomer Moshe El Ha'am. 1 second. I just have to continue. Vayomer Hashem El Moshe. The people said, don't speak to us. So God says it to Moshe, Ko Tamar B'nai Israel. This is what you should tell them. Now, if you want to, you could, and Rav Soloveitchik was very fond of this type of an approach. You could say that this is the first example of Torah Sheba'al Peh. You can say that Torah Shebachtav is a Seret HaDibrot, and now Torah Sheba'al Peh is the explanation of it, which actually opens up in our minds this incredible possibility that what would have happened had the people not been afraid and God spoken directly to them, then maybe the Mishnah would have come directly from God. Maybe any other content that we eventually get out of the Gemara and from other places could have come directly to God from God to the people, rather than have it communicated in other ways, whereby the people missed that direct opportunity. Then Pasuk Aleph, it continues and it says, Mizbach Adamat Aseli v'Zavachta Alav, make a Mizbeach, and that's where you're going to offer Olotcha v'Shlamcha et Tzoncha b'Korecha b'Chol HaMakom Asher Askiret Shmi Avo Elech U'Varchtecha. And that's also really quite interesting and important. and we'll decide how much next week to come back to this. Ve'im mizbach avanim taseli lo tivneten gazit. If you're going to make it out of adama, don't use metal, because the use of metal, which is used to kill, on a mizbeach is something which is a chilul Hashem in a sense. And don't climb up on the mizbeach, asher tigale ervatcha alav, which is understood as saying is that the Kohanim need to have tzniut. Here you have the first example of tzniut mentioned to Kohanim and how they work. When they're walking wearing their dresses or their jalabiyas, then make sure that just realize that as you're climbing upstairs, somebody could be looking from below and nobody's even looking. What is it saying? The Mizbeach is going to look, and it's not right for the Mizbeach. So here you have touching erva, touching arayot. And so the first two things in terms of use, right? Really, anochi and lo, yeah, is clear. What these other elements are doing right over here are not as clear. And then we go straight into this ve'ela mishpatim. That's the next words now. Ve'ela mishpatim. Ela mishpatim compared to what? Because mishpatim, let's accept the Ibn Ezra. Mishpatim are all about taking care of the downtrodden. Mishpatim are all about not using our power in order to dominate others. Over here, it talked about things which are not mishpatim, but maybe we'd be more comfortable to call them chukim, things having to do with service of God. Correct? That's what are you going to build a mizbeach? That's not about the downtrodden. Although there's something which is really interesting, don't use a sword. Don't use something which you can use to dominate others as you're building this mizbeach. That's just a really interesting crossover between the laws which are about to come up with this law which is presented here, if I'm also now going to move over to other sensibilities, again, perhaps in terms of arayot. By the way, that's also going to be the question, to what extent are any arayot really over here? Perhaps we'll see. And saying, be very careful about modesty and so on, and in the context of the Mizbeach. Again, that's really interesting. It's doubly interesting if you come to the realization to what extent in antiquity, maybe not just antiquity, where idolatry involved all kinds of cultic sexual misbehavior. So over here saying, not only is that not going to be part of our service, it's going to be even have sensitivity on a much, much more, say on a much higher level. Be careful about any kind of impropriety. So again, those are crossovers and they're interesting. If I had to put it, I could say we just now entered into the world of Kodshim, but it didn't let go of all the laws of the Arayot, which is again really an interesting comment. The Ramban, source 5, Tam ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim aleim, ki ratzah lakdim lahem mishpatim ki kasher haya b'aseret hadibrot hadibur rishon b'diur. So therefore, what's the Ramban doing? And I already told you who's going to do this. He is looking how this directly follows the aseret hadibrot. Ve'ela mishpatim, how far back did we just now go? We just went back to aseret hadibrot, and you saw and you already understand what it is he's going to explain. And I already told you outside this teaching of the Ramban. So essentially, the aseret hadibrot are here, and I told you that's the easiest thing to do, not just in those couple verses after the aseret hadibrot, when the people say stop speaking, but also going into the mishpatim. That you're going to hear certain things, striking somebody down and so on. Don't murder. Something about parents. That fits in. Not to steal. Okay, I see. And by the way, not even to kidnap. You could just, it's going to be too easy as you go through and say, I see how this is the shear that somebody's giving. That's why I want to go back and say Torah Shabbat Peh. This is the lecture that somebody's giving about how to use these aseret hadibrot in real life. One of the things the Ramban points out is that's what's going on. Again, let's just skip a little bit more. Which is great. Where do I fit in all these mishpatim? By lo tachmod. Lo tachmod essentially, how do you say lo tachmod in a positive way? If you don't want to say negative, you want to be positive, what do you say? You say v'haftarecha kamocha. Right? Isn't that easy enough? Love your neighbor as yourself, instead of saying don't desire and don't covet and so on. So again, that becomes really interesting. And then look at the last couple lines there. Dinim achar aseret hadibrot. V'chein yifaresh be'el mishpatim ha'mishpat ba'avodah zarah u'v'kivud av. Can't tell you where to look. It's all there. V'haritzicha. And I told you all this. V'haniyuf. See, the niyuf is a little funny. He says, look in Kaf Bet Yud Chet. We'll see in a second. Hanizkarim be'aseret hadibrot. So if you're going to pay attention carefully, you're going to find most of the aseret hadibrot right over here. Anyway, the thing about niyuf, by the way, source number 6, kol shochev im behema mot yumat, which is really an unfortunate of all the things to say. You're talking about bestiality, yeah, that teaches you about all the other arayot. Okay, let me just say one thing about that. I think in the world that at least some people live in today, a world which is very progressive, where essentially any kind of limitations on sexual behavior would be considered to be biased and hate-filled and so on and so forth. I think the last thing, right, which hasn't fallen yet, the last thing is bestiality, but not because they think it's inappropriate, is because the animal didn't consent, which means it's essentially the animal rights people would still have much more of a problem. So it's interesting, in order to use the most extreme example, and rather than something which would be a minor example. In source number 7, the Mechilta tells us, "Ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim nimtzenu lemedim shesanhedrin ba'in bitzad mizbeach." Now, again, I love this. I'll have to explain this. What did he just now do? He went from the end of last week's parsha. What was the last thing there? It was about climbing the Mizbeach. And what's the first thing over here? The first thing is Elam Mishpatim. And what did he just now tell us? Something which you already know. And what's that? Ki mitzion teitzei Torah dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. Which means when you have the Temple Mount, and what's on the Temple Mount? This is not a trick question. The temple. And what else is on the Temple Mount? The Mizbeach. And what else is on the Temple Mount? The Sanhedrin. So what he says over here, if you really just now paid attention, what will you notice? You'll notice that this is teaching you that the Sanhedrin needs to be right next to the Beit HaMikdash, which is great, except for two problems. One is that there's no mention of a Sanhedrin, the other is no mention of the Beit HaMikdash, unless there was. Right? So what did he just now do? What did the Mechilta just now do? It gave us, again, more energy for that Ibn Ezra saying, no, it's all about Eretz Yisrael. I mean, don't lose focus over here. It's all about, which means the Torah is practiced in its highest possible form, and I'm going to say this in every single way, in the land of Israel, including that's where you have a proper legal system and you have a body which is able to legislate and able to interpret and able to give rulings. And part of the problem of living in a world like we do today, where we don't have proper legal abilities and therefore responsibilities, we live in a world where things are somewhat limited. So continue in the Mechilta, and we're going to go back now, because that was Mechilta in Parshat Mishpatim. Now we're going back to the Mechilta in Parshat Yitro. Sorry. That was in Parshat Yitro. And now we're going to, in Mishpatim, source number 8, Ve'ela Mishpatim. Rabbi Yishmael, now just try to pay attention here along the way, because what you're going to find is that there are multiple opinions which are being shared. First one is Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael, Eile Mosifim ala Elyonim. My Elyonim misinai, af Tachtonim misinai, which means he's dealing with the question of authority. So what we had was the Aseret HaDibrot, and now Mishpatim, there's more things which we're saying. These things both come from the same source. And by the way, as we've been reading, that's obvious. God said these, God said those, and maybe even it's a little stronger. Maybe even we would have had this thought that the Aseret HaDibrot are more important, more basic, more an expression of Judaism, and say, no, these are from Sinai, and these are from Sinai. This is the continuation. And again, if you keep in mind the context that we've already seen, what was that context? That was a context of the people saying, stop. We're going to keep on paying attention to that. Stop. You realize this is what should have been the continuation. So let's continue. That's Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ve'el mishpatim b'mora shenemar sham sam lo choko mishpat. Now, remember I said before that once you say that it's a question of context, then I have an ability of going as far back as I want. So what did he do? He went a little further back. What was the interesting linguistic hook? There it also said mishpat. So there it says mishpat, here it says mishpatim. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is ve'ela mishpatim. Where should we be looking? It's not just a Aseret HaDibrot. This already comes earlier, and it comes from Mora. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omar, Harei Hagoyim Shadanu Kedina Yisrael. Now, right here, he's going even broader, dealing with non-Jewish law. So what did we just now get to? The Sheva Mitzvot. I told you before. We did all, I got you prepared for all of this. Sheva Mitzvot. But then he says something which is really interesting, and he says that the legal system of the non-Jews does not apply to us unless their legal system is applying our laws. I don't know if that worked for you. He actually gave an example which is really important today as well. He says, for example, let's say Talmud Lomer last, ve'ela mishpatim, atadan et shalahem, ve'hin inan danin et shilcha, v'kan amru get ha'mu'useh, b'Yisrael kasher, u'v'goyim pasul. What is a get like that? It's a get which is being forced by the court. The court says you must give a get. But if the non-Jews say, do what the Jewish law says, and they use force, that is a kosher get. I don't have to tell you that this is a point which, even though it's black and white over here, among certain people, this is something which is debated, but I hope you appreciate the significance. Rav Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Ma ra'u dinim l'kodim l'kol mitzvot shebetorah kishadin bedadim l'chaveiro tachrut b'neihem nitpasek lehem din na'aseh shalom b'neihem v'chein yitru omer l'Moshe im zeh hadavar asher taseh. Essentially saying, derech eretz kadim l'Torah, we need peace, we need to be able to get along. And he's saying, what we have over here is essentially, really, at least conceptually considered, it is a continuation of the Torah told Moshe, and why we need there to be a system whereby people can get rid of all of their complaints and we can work together as one people. Now, let's try again. So what's missing? So I told you what's missing in Eretz Yisrael, but something else is missing, more or less. So we'll find it. What's missing is Kedusha. Because torts are not necessarily holy. Now, you can argue with me if you want. For the very reason that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai just now argued, creating peace is something which is very holy. On the other hand, somebody could be involved all day in studying torts, or for that matter, studying a sugya. You can decide now, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra, anything, what you want, and not have any kind of sense of holiness. The first reference to holiness in Parshat Mishpatim, where it uses the word, and maybe I'm guilty of being a little too literal, source number 9, Anshe Kodesh Tiyuli, first time, didn't say Anshe Kodesh, and therefore it did say how to treat the slaves, because you were slaves in Egypt. The amount of times that it says, because you were slaves, and you should remember the Egyptian experience, and therefore you should know decency, and decency should be a part of your inner world, all of that's clear, but it didn't use the phrase of holiness, and I accept your argument that you're going to say to me, but doing these things is holiness. Nonetheless, the word holiness wasn't used. Over here it says, by the way, for that matter, holiness is only used one time by only one of the Serat HaDibrot. Give me a second. V'anshe kodesh tiyun li, uvasar b'sadeh treifa lo tochlu lekelev tashlichun oto. We're back to the animals, by the way. What does it say over here? Be holy. And what does it mean to be holy? Here the description of holiness is, don't eat meat which is treif. Don't eat treif food, because that's what holiness is. Which is actually really interesting now, because are you going to call this a mishpat? This is not a question of mishpatim. This is a question of ritual. This is ritually inappropriate for me. It's not a question that this is something which is, by definition, good or bad. No. It's a question of, and by the way, holiness is therefore really interesting to use over here. In last week's parsha, we had holiness in source number 10. You should be a holy people. And of course, my question is, how do you become a holy people? And your answer is going to be, we'll keep all of the commandments. But what about the specific use of the word holiness? In source 11, it's the only one of the 10 commandments, and I hope you figured out which one it was. Zochoret Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. And at the end, Al Kain Barach Hashem et Yom HaShabbat v'yikadshehu. Again, we can go into a longer discussion about Shabbat. I mean, we won't. I'm saying we could. But it's interesting that if I compare the Aseret HaDibrot with the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, I would be able to have a pretty interesting correlation other than Shabbat. I know that you can argue, okay, what about honoring parents? But that's exactly the point. Honoring parents, the Gemara is telling us we didn't need it. I mean, think about it. The whole Tanakh and the entire Gemara, the worldview that they embrace is one of the enemy is idolatry. For the Gemara to come and say, well, what is the greatest example that we know of somebody who kept the mitzvah of honoring their parents when it says, Avodat kochavim echad haya be'ashkelon, v'dama ben netina shemo, to use, before Asa, to use dama ben netina, an idolater, and say, oh, he knew how to honor his father. By the way, the Yerushalmi also his mother, he knew how to honor both of them. Use Esav and other, which means when the Gemara is telling you that these people excelled in this, I don't want to use the word mitzvah. I want to say they excelled within this ethic, perhaps midah. They recognized. Listen, I grew up in Bensonhurst. A lot of Italians. Great way to start a fight is to say your mother. Doesn't have to say. Doesn't make a difference at the end of the sentences, right? You just start with that, and that's you'll hear all kinds of things in Italian. And by the way, there's something very respectful about somebody who's going to properly honor their parents. Again, I'm not saying that at all in a sense, quite the opposite. I'm questioning why the Torah has to make it one of the Ten Commandments and why it needs to be continued in this week's Parsha. Because things that you're going to do on yourself, you don't necessarily need to be legislated. The Aruch HaShulchan writes in laws of honoring parents is this is the most logical of all commandments, which by the way, just I have to tell you something about it, so just one more thing. When they say that the Ten Commandments, the right side is between man and God, and the left side is between man and man, so you realize there's a problem there, right? It means it could mean whoever said that couldn't count to 5. So apparently, this natural inclination that we have to honor our parents. Why? Because they brought us into this world. Why? Because they gave us sustenance. Why? Because they gave us a place to live. Why? They give us clothing. They give us food. They give us everything. And then if I stop and I think, well, ultimately, who brought me into this world? Ultimately, who gives me a place to stay? Ultimately, who gives me something to eat? It all comes down to God, which means the natural inclination to honor parents should be utilized in terms of the service of God. And that's why it's on the right side, because it's the utility of the first 5 in order to work on the relationship of a person and the Creator. And the second one is completely, not just the actions. The actions are with people, but again, with the 5th one, but it is the motivation of the second 5 is in terms of interpersonal. So I hope that made a little bit of sense. Rashi in source number 12 on this verse that you're a holy people. Imatem kadoshim uprushin. Now remember, Rashi also in Parshat Kedoshim says kadoshim to you. You should be holy. What does holy mean? To be separate. Over here as well. Imatem kadoshim uprushim mishukutse nevelot v'treifot. He just made a little bit broader, not just nevela, but treifa as well. Hareatem shali. Which means be a holy people. By the way, this also tells us that Judaism is not just about morality in the sense of right and wrong, but it's also about holiness. And this other element of holiness, but I'm going to again point out, for the most part of the Ten Commandments, we didn't see it, even though you can argue with me regarding all of the ones which are between man and or a person and their Creator. Let's see how much we're going to skip over here along the way. In source number 13, it's just from Devarim. It's just, you know what, we're going to skip those 2. Let's go to 15. We now move to chapter 23. V'sheishanim tizrat artzecha. You notice something that just now changed from all the other ones? Yes? The land of Israel just now made an appearance. It wasn't there. It wasn't there at all till this point. And suddenly, very quietly, unassumingly, oh yeah, by the way, work for 6 years and collect all of your wheat. Vashviyit tishmetena unetashta v'ochlu evyonei amecha, and so on. Now it's interesting because there's also a social point over here. It also involves the week, the Evyonei Amecha, and so on. Sheshet yamim taseh ma'asecha v'yom hashvi tishbot l'man yinuach shorecha v'chamerecha v'yinafesh ben amatcha v'hager. Again, you can say, oh, look how we're protecting the weak. All that's there. But again, something has changed. What has changed? Again, we made the leap on the one hand to the land of Israel, and now we've made to this other thing that has to do with holiness. By the way, it started with food, but the shift over here now is one which I hope that you notice as you keep on reading this section, there's something else that hopefully will jump out. So one is we have the Shalosh Regalim. And it also says that you're going to make a pilgrimage, v'lo yiru panai rekam. If you look at Pasuk Yud Zayin, Shalosh Pamim B'Shana, Yireh Kol Zochot Panei Adon Hashem. Now what does that mean? How do you make a pilgrimage? Because we don't know anything about a certain structure that will one day stand in Jerusalem. If you continue a little bit, it says, Pasuk Yud Tet, this is the one that you have to contend with, and maybe we'll come back to it next week. Reish Pikirei Adamatcha Tavi Beit Hashem Elokecha. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. So now you have to take a deep breath. What? Exactly. And by the way, how many times have you been told, no, the whole idea of the Mishkan is only there after the Chet Egel. So we have a challenge over here because it just now said, and we didn't make a mistake. When I said a couple verses before that on these holidays you're going to make a pilgrimage to where? It says to where? Beit Hashem Elokecha. So now we're in the land of Israel. That's the context. We just now entered the land, and it also threw in on top of everything else, which is also a law of kosher. We've entered into a realm of holiness. Again, you want to tell me that there's a Mishpatim element beneath the surface. There's something about kindness, and I'm willing to accept anything you want to say. I can do it also if you want. I can build up that argument. The only thing is that a shift took place. Mishpatim, for the most part, could have been applied any place in the world, and we just now changed. We just now changed to things that have to do with the land of Israel. So, I would have loved if the Ibn Ezra actually defended his position and actually, told us this. He didn't, so it makes it a little bit more interesting. And then Pasuk Kaf comes. I'm going to send my, what do you want to call it? My angel, my emissary, my messenger, to guide you along the way, to bring you to the place. So now what can you no longer avoid? What just now somehow made it in here? So Eretz Yisrael is here. And again, it wasn't there, Parakov Aleph and Kav Bet. We got through all kinds of nice mishpatim taking care of the downtrodden, but suddenly we're told there is something else over here. And then it ends up, rather stop all of us, which means everything changes, gets the land of Israel, don't worship idols. What we were told by that's what it's all about. It's all about and it's interesting how he did that, skipping all the details along the way, but now at least you can understand why that is a defensible position. The Rashbam in source 17 tells us who's this Malach. Look in Sefer Yeshua, you'll find your Malach. You want to see Sefer Yeshua, look at source 18, which is really interesting, but this is about the passage into the land of Israel. It tells us over here, and they enter into the land. Yeshua does a Brit Milah for them. The month stops falling. They celebrate Pesach. And then this malach appears in front, and this malach is there to help them with the conquest. Whole new, again, now is time. Rashi says something, and this is where we have to get to. Rashi in source 19. Hinei nochi shaleach malach. Kahn nitpasru she'etitin chto. Here they were told that they were destined to sin. Now this is completely frightening. This is the point. You now no longer know what to do, and you're going to start bothering me with issues of predeterminism and so on and so forth. But right here it says, they already told it's not going to work out. Now, where in the world did he get this from? He tells you. And God says, I will not be in your midst. And of course, he's referring to the source which is written there in parentheses, which is number 20, Perek Lamed Gimel, which is where it's right after the Chet Egel. And what does God says, I'll destroy the people, and Moshe prays. And then God says, V'deber Hashem Moshe, Lech alei mizeh, atava am asher halita mi'eretz Mitzrayim. You go and take your people, right? That you understood that correctly. Ela aretz asher nishbati. Okay, God said, I made a vow, so I'm going to keep my word and go take them. V'shalachti lefanechem malach, and I'll send for you an angel, whatever that means. V'gerashti taknani v'amariach itiya priziyah chavivi uvisi. God, again, I'll keep my word. I won't be in your midst. Good luck. Now that Vishalachti lefanecha malach. What did Rashi just now do for us? Our favorite theory of conservation of angels, and says, oh, it's the same angel being referenced over here as referenced over there. There's only one thing which is really frightening, and what's that? That's after the sin, and this is before the sin. The Ramban in 21, which we're not going to have time to go into, is going to tell us that if you continue the story, Moshe prays and says to God, we need you in our midst. What do you mean we won't be in our midst? And God says, okay, I'll be in your midst. So he claims that only happens during Moshe's lifetime, and therefore it's correct that by Yoshua is where the angel appears. The angel appearing and saying, well, that's a good thing, but that's God kind of backing out of the story, and the malach being put there, which, by the way, for us, you want to put this a little differently, we were just now told the month stopped, which means our life in the desert was this supernatural existence, and now we're going to have to move into a natural existence, and now there's going to be this malach, whatever that means, as opposed to God micromanaging in our midst. So we need some kind of a conclusion for today, don't we? Part of what I'm not going to get to is going to be source 22, and I suspect 23 and 24 and 25. But what I will note about that is that all of this is the end of Vayikra section, which absolutely parallels what we've done today. And we'll have to save this for another shir to see how this is all connected. But you do have cursing, you do have ayin tachat ayin, you do have the holidays, you do have Shemitah, you do have Bechukotai, the Brit, all the elements are there, and now and even maybe the best is the very conclusion of source 25, Eila chukim v'mishpatim v'torot asher natan Hashem beino uvein b'nei Yisrael b'har Sinai b'yad Moshe, which means this is the conclusion of it, so you realize the conclusion actually bears a similarity to the start of the entire thing. But first I want to go back now, and this is as far as we're going to get today. I'm going to try to understand that Rashi, which is absolutely frightening. Where Rashi says that at this point it was ready, they were going to sin. Now, what troubles us with that is that how could the Torah tell us, well, you're going to sin, and therefore the Malach is going to go instead of me, when they haven't sinned yet? Can we go back now to context again? I told you, the whole thing's about context. What was the context? What had they just said to Moshe? They said, we don't want God to speak to us. And what does Moshe say back? Well, if God speaks to you, you're not going to sin. What happens when God doesn't speak to them? They sin. Whether you want to be more literal than that, be more literal. Moshe is going to go off for 40 days and 40 nights. And what's going to happen? They're going to say, well, if God speaks to us, we're going to die. And what's in their mind? If God speaks, you're going to die. What happens when Moshe doesn't come down? What do they conclude? Well, he must be dead, because if God speaks to you, you're going to die. What else do we now realize? That Moshe never would have gone up for 40 days and 40 nights if God would have spoken directly to the people. So what happens when Moshe is away for 40 days and 40 nights? They get frightened. And what happens when they get frightened? Then they say, well, we need something, and they build their golden calf. And what happens to build a golden calf? God says, okay, I'm not going to go with you. I'm going to send an angel instead. Which means this verse that Rashi is saying, oh, look how ominous this is. This means they're going to sin. It's not that we're predicting the future. We're actually explaining the past. That the implications of not being willing to accept the Torah directly from God is what directly leads to the Chet HaEgel. That's what Rashi is pointing out over here. And by the way, if Rashi had to defend the position, what are we talking about the Beit HaMikdash? Why do we need a Beit HaMikdash? Right? Again, I'm not even saying that this is really Rashi's position, but let's just say some people claim that Rashi said there never would have been a Chet HaEgel, there wouldn't have been a Beit HaMikdash. So what's a Beit Hashem doing over here? The answer is because they're going to sin. They're going to sin, they're going to need the Beit HaMikdash, which means the fact that the Beit HaMikdash is mentioned in this week's Parsha is not evidence that it's there before the Chet HaEgel, because the Chet HaEgel is we're already going down that track. I don't want to even say the word inevitable, but I'll say the word inevitable. It's something which now we're on that trajectory. The implication of not accepting the word of God is the fear of God would have been upon you and you won't sin. So now the fear of God is not upon you, and now they're going to sin. So now they're going to sin, and now a whole other world is going to emerge. I am not saying that what I just now explained is simple. There were references to the Beit HaMikdash. Again, Parshat Truma next to it. When you really talk about it, Beit HaMikdash was already there in the Shira, in the Az Yashir, if you read carefully or even not carefully. There are references, of course, by Yaakov. He's going to build Beit Elokim. But for us, we're back to this, what if kind of a question. And when I look back at Parshat Mishpatim, and I say, Parshat Mishpatim is about the content and the context. And over here, what exactly is the content is interesting, because how broad do you want to go? What exactly is the context? So now we realize what may very well be the guess. It's after the Aseret Dibrot, but that's exactly the point. There wasn't supposed to be an after the Aseret Dibrot as a separate thing. There was supposed to be God still speaking to them, which would have changed everything. So ultimately what we're hearing then is not being willing to listen to the word of God is something which is actually spiritually debilitating. Certainly not following the word of God is debilitating, but not listening directly to the word of God when God is willing to speak to us is something which obviously has an impact. And that's what Moshe says. And everything that happens, Ve'ela Mishpatim, is following that point until we finally get to the Malach. And Rashi says, of course that Malach is here. Why? Because of course they're going to sin. Where does he get it from their sin? It's not just looking forward after the Chet Egel. It's going back and looking beforehand when they say, go, let God speak to you, because this is too intense for us. So maybe sometimes we have to be willing to embrace intense situations. Shabbat Shalom.